In many nations, a state-owned ferry is a symbol of national pride and a lifeline connecting distant regions, a mobile piece of the country itself. For Senegal, the MV La Joola was precisely that, and so much more. The handsome, white-hulled passenger ferry was the only direct link between the southern province of Casamance, a region isolated by geography and a deadly separatist conflict, and the capital, Dakar. To travel by land was an arduous, expensive, and often dangerous journey through neighbouring Gambia, involving border crossings and checkpoints. The Joola, therefore, was the people's bridge. It was a floating community where markets were held, families reunited, soldiers travelled to and from their posts, and students journeyed to university. On the afternoon of September 26, 2002, as it prepared to depart from the port of Ziguinchor, the Joola was, as always, bustling with life. But this routine voyage was set against a backdrop of decay, negligence, and a total abdication of responsibility that would soon plunge the ship and nearly 2,000 souls into a watery abyss in the second deadliest peacetime maritime disaster ever recorded. The MV La Joola was a disaster foretold in years of warning signs. The German-built vessel, launched in 1990, was designed to carry a maximum of 536 passengers plus crew for a total of around 580 people. This official capacity, however, had long been treated as a mere suggestion, ignored by everyone involved. The ship was the only affordable link for the people of Casamance, and the demand was overwhelming. For years it had sailed in a state of chronic and extreme overloading. Tickets were sold with abandon, and countless more people, merchants with their goods, students, entire families, simply crowded aboard, their passage secured with a small bribe to a crew member. On its final voyage, it is estimated that the Joola was carrying at least 1,900 people, more than 3 times its legal limit. The decks were a dense mass of humanity, its cargo holds stuffed with produce like mangoes and palm oil, sacks of rice, cars, motorcycles, and other goods, making the ship dangerously top-heavy. Compounding this lethal overcrowding was the vessel's appalling mechanical condition. The Joola had been out of service for nearly a year, undergoing repairs in Dakar, and had only recently been rushed back into operation to meet public demand. Critical maintenance had been neglected. It was known to have persistent problems with its engines and a faulty portside door that did not close properly. Most damningly, the ship was inherently unstable, a flaw in its very design. Built for the calmer coastal waters of Europe, it was dangerously vulnerable to capsizing if it listed beyond 20 degrees, a condition known as having poor transverse stability. It was a ship that, if pushed too far by a wave or a strong gust of wind, would simply roll over with no hope of recovery. The crew was aware of these issues, the port authorities were aware, and the government that owned the ship was absolutely aware. But a culture of corruption and indifference allowed the floating time bomb to continue sailing. The voyage began in a festive atmosphere. As the Joola pulled away from Ziguinchor, the decks were a vibrant scene of Senegalese life. Music played, people danced, merchants sold grilled fish and peanuts, and children ran through the crowded corridors. For many it was the start of a holiday, or a return to work in the capital. But as night fell, and the ship sailed out of the mouth of the Casamance River and into the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Gambia, the weather turned. A storm, a seasonal squall common to the region, began to gather strength. The sky, which had been clear, turned a threatening black. The wind picked up and the sea grew rough. For a stable, properly loaded ship, it would have been an inconvenience requiring passengers to head indoors. For the dangerously top-heavy and unstable La Joola, it was a death sentence. At approximately 11 p.m, the storm hit the vessel with its full force. Torrential rain lashed the decks and winds exceeding 70 kilometers per hour slammed into the ship's portside. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The overloaded upper decks, crowded with people and unsecured goods, acted like a sail, catching the wind and pushing the ship over. It listed violently, sending a cascade of cargo, vehicles, and people sliding across the decks in a horrifying avalanche. The list quickly exceeded its critical point of no return. In less than 5 minutes, with a deafening roar of twisting metal, smashing cargo, and the collective scream of nearly 2,000 people, the MV La Joola capsized completely, rolling over and trapping the vast majority of its passengers inside its dark, submerged hull. There was no time to launch the lifeboats, no time to send a distress signal, no time for anything but a few seconds of abject terror before the ship was upside down in the churning water. What followed was one of the most horrifying and shameful chapters in the history of maritime rescue. The ship capsized in relatively shallow international waters, but no distress call had been sent. For hours, the Senegalese and Gambian authorities were completely unaware of the disaster. The first to discover the nightmare were local fishermen, who came upon a surreal and horrific sight in the pre-dawn light, the upturned hull of the massive ferry looking like a dead whale, surrounded by a vast field of debris and floating bodies. Clinging to the slippery, exposed hull were a small group of survivors who had been on the upper decks and managed to escape the sinking vessel and climb on top. These survivors would endure a second ordeal, a long, torturous night and morning. They were stranded on a surreal island of the dead and dying, listening to the muffled sounds of those still trapped alive inside the hull, banging, screaming and crying that slowly faded over the next few hours as the air pockets filled with water. The official rescue effort was agonizingly, criminally slow. Despite being alerted by the fishermen early in the morning, the Senegalese military, whose own soldiers were on the ship, did not dispatch rescue teams for many hours. Bureaucratic indecision and a lack of resources created a fatal paralysis. It was not until the afternoon of September 27th, more than 15 hours after the ship had capsized, that the first official rescue vessels arrived. By then, many who had survived the initial sinking had succumbed to hypothermia, drowned after losing their grip on the hull, or were reportedly taken by sharks that had been drawn to the scene. The divers who finally entered the wreck were met with a scene from a nightmare. The interior was a tangled, dark maze of bodies, corridors and stairwells blocked by the dead, many of whom were found holding their children. They managed to find a few survivors in air pockets, but they were the last. The vast majority of the victims were women and children, trapped on the lower, more crowded decks. In the end, of the estimated 1,927 people on board, only 64 were rescued. At least 1,863 people had died, a staggering loss of life that makes it the second deadliest non-military maritime disaster in history, with a death toll far exceeding that of the Titanic and the MS Estonia combined. The aftermath was a story of national trauma and official evasion. The Senegalese government was heavily criticised for its slow response, its attempts to downplay the death toll, and its abject failure to hold anyone accountable. A government report ultimately blamed the captain who went down with his ship and the endemic overloading, but no high-ranking officials were ever prosecuted for allowing a dangerously unseaworthy and overcrowded ship to sail. The families of the victims were left with little more than grief and a profound sense of betrayal by the state that was supposed to protect them. The wreck of Joola was left on the seabed for years before being partially salvaged. The sinking of the MV Joola was a man-made catastrophe, a predictable and preventable slaughter born from a culture of corruption, greed, and a staggering indifference to human life. It stands as a profoundly disturbing monument to the consequences of systemic failure, where a nation's pride became its greatest shame and a routine ferry ride became one of the darkest nights in the history of the sea.